How much of those expressions are conveyed through verbal communication? More often than not, our intense emotions are conveyed non-verbally. More often than not, our intense emotions are conveyed non-verbally through gestures, body position, facial expression, vocal cues, eye contact, use of space, and touching. Imagine what would happen if you don't understand this bubble. What might you experience? Possibly discomfort, irritation, maybe even anger. It could express affection, anger, playfulness, control, status. These are just a few functions of touch. In some cultures, it is common to see same-sex friends holding hands and embracing in public. This behavior is not interpreted as sexual. However, think about this behavior in some other cultures. Is it appropriate? Today we're going to start looking at nonverbal language. Nonverbal communication has often been referred to as the hidden dimension of communication. Sometimes this dimension is so subtle that we do not even recognize the ways it shapes what we're saying or how people interpret our meaning. In fact, when you think about it, think of some of the emotions that you express in everyday life, like happiness, joy, sadness, and anger, irritation. How much of those expressions are conveyed through verbal communication? More often than not, our intense emotions are conveyed non-verbally through gestures, body position, facial expression, vocal cues, eye contact, use of space, and touching. Okay, now let me make 2 points about how nonverbal communication functions. One is, sometimes when we communicate, it may only be through the nonverbal cues. The nonverbal gesture carries all our meaning. But secondly, nonverbal cues also function to help us interpret the verbal message. And this is the point I want to focus on first, that nonverbal cues help interpret a verbal message. Where we see this really, in a very subtle way, is through the use of humor and sarcasm. You know, in humor and sarcasm, the verbal message, what is actually said, is only a small part of the message. It's often the nonverbal cues that signal, hey, how's this message to be taken? Seriously or not? I mean, do they really mean it, or are they joking? Take, for example, when an American sees a new style of clothing which they may not like, how they might signal that they don't like it. Well, they might say, oh, that's a good look. Well, okay, now if you're from a different culture, how do you know if they really mean it, or if they're being sarcastic and they really mean the opposite? Well, it's very difficult because it's the nonverbal cues, not the words, that are carrying the meaning here. It's usually the tone of voice or a facial expression. I guess this is why a lot of international students often tell me that it's humor that's the most difficult part of American culture to understand, and similarly when Americans go abroad. There's another area of nonverbal communication that is often overlooked, and in this case, the nonverbal gesture carries all the meaning, and that is proxemics. That's P-R-O-X-E-M-I-C-S. Proxemics refers to our personal space. The anthropologist Edward Hall calls this personal space of ours our body bubbles. Body bubbles are interesting because they're very subtle. You hardly ever recognize them until someone pops your bubble. In other words, when somebody comes too close or violates your private space, you are suddenly conscious. You become conscious of the bubble. So what do you do when somebody pops your bubble? Do you feel uncomfortable? Do you move away? Do you turn your position? Do you put your books in front of you? Do you suddenly close your jacket? We tend to adapt our body position when our bubbles get invaded. We see this in crowded elevators, for example. Body bubbles are influenced by many factors: How intimate is the relationship? What is the social context? A party or a bus? What is the gender relationship? However, a strong influence on body bubbles is culture. For example, in Latin American and Middle Eastern cultures, the kind of conversational space, the space between two people just engaged in everyday conversations, is relatively very close compared to Asian and American cultures. Imagine what would happen if you don't understand this bubble. What might you experience? Possibly discomfort, irritation, maybe even anger. And a third area of nonverbal communication, an area that's extremely powerful, where there are very strong norms, that's kind of social, unspoken social rules, strong norms that are easily violated, is the area of touching. Touch is one of the most sensitive areas of nonverbal communication because touch is never neutral. Take the case of shaking hands with someone. We never think of shaking hands as a form of touch. It seems almost like a ritual. But in fact, it's one of the major forms of touch between strangers. Now, in American culture, for example, we value firm handshakes. I mean, if a handshake is weak and limp, we might say he or she shakes hands like a fish. Touch is really amazing. It's very subtle and complex. Think for a moment about some of the functions of touch. What could it express? Well, it could express affection, anger, playfulness, control, status. These are just a few functions of touch. Two major influences on touching behavior. Think about your body bubbles again. One is gender, and the other is culture. We can see both influences of gender and of culture when we contrast same-sex touching. This would be touching between two men or between two women. In some cultures, it is common to see same-sex friends holding hands and embracing in public. This behavior is not interpreted as sexual. However, think about this behavior in some other cultures. Is it appropriate? Could it be taboo? I recall my own surprise. I remember when I was visiting in China, and I would see young men holding hands in the streets, and young women also. And at first, I was surprised, but I thought it was, very affectionate, very warm. So I decided that I was going to incorporate the same habit when I came back to the United States. So my sister and I started to hold hands in public, but we felt very awkward about it, and we stopped doing it. So you see, the norms for touching are very powerful. They're easy to violate, and as I discovered, they're difficult to change. That is why it is very important to understand what is appropriate touch and what is taboo in another culture. Last, I think we have to remember that even misinterpretations and confusion in nonverbal communication don't always end in serious misinterpretations or anger or alienation. They're oftentimes the source of a lot of humor, a lot of laughter, and a lot of camaraderie between people of different cultures.